8 months. That's how long Natalie Hayes had been restocking supply carts at Oak Creek Memorial without anyone asking her name. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like electricity trapped in glass, and she moved through the corridors of the hospital with the kind of efficiency that made her invisible. A floor nurse. Anonymous. Unremarkable. Just the way she needed it. The antiseptic smell of the hallway was sharp and metallic, cutting through the warmth of the afternoon. She rolled the metal cart past patient rooms with methodical precision, checking off items on a laminated sheet, gauze packs, saline bags, full lines, tape. Her hands moved with surgical accuracy, each item placed in its designated slot, nothing wasted, nothing fumbled. Muscle memory from another life. A life she'd spent 12 years building in places most people would never see on a map. Raleigh was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be the kind of place where nobody looked too closely at the woman in scrubs who ate lunch alone and left shift without stopping to chat. She'd chosen the night shifts when possible, the early mornings when the hospital was still half asleep. No questions. No stories. No one asking where she learned to move like she was still conducting tactical medicine in a combat zone. The supply closet was empty except for the humming of the refrigeration units keeping the medications at precise temperatures. Natalie closed the door behind her and allowed herself one moment, just one, where she reached for the jacket hanging on the hook. Her fingers found the inside lining, felt the faded unit patch sewn there with careful stitches. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. She didn't look at it. She never looked at it. But she touched it the way other people touched wedding rings or photos of children they'd left behind. A reminder that she existed somewhere other than this fluorescent-lit corridor in North Carolina. The tremor in her left hand started when she stopped moving. It was there now, a slight shake in her fingers as she held the jacket. Phantom pain, they'd called it. Not pain exactly. More like her nervous system's way of remembering. She clenched her fist, counted to 4, and it stopped. It always stopped when she had something to do. She hung the jacket back in place and returned to the hallway. That's when she saw Dr. Sterling. He was standing in the doorway of room for 12, watching her work on the 4 line for Mrs. Chen, a post-operative patient recovering from a bowel resection. Natalie didn't acknowledge his presence. She never did. But she felt the weight of his observation the way a rabbit feels a hawk circling overhead, a species-level awareness of danger. Her hands didn't change rhythm. That was the trick. The discipline she'd learned was the same whether she was in a field hospital outside San Juan Valley or in a climate-controlled room in a civilian hospital in Raleigh. Focus on the work. Let your hands do what they're trained to do. Never show that you notice you're being watched. The 4 line needed 3 loops of tape to secure it properly, a technique most nurses accomplished in 8 or 9 seconds with small adjustments and repositioning. Natalie did it in 4. The first loop went under the catheter hub, creating tension. The second loop angled perpendicular, locking it in place. The third loop sealed the configuration so perfectly that the line would hold even under the movement and stress of a patient trying to pull at it in post-surgical delirium. The technique had a name, the 3-loop protocol, and it wasn't something they taught in civilian nursing schools. It was something they taught in forward surgical teams when speed and precision meant the difference between a soldier keeping an arm and losing it to infection. She secured the last piece of tape and stepped back. Dr. Sterling's expression shifted. It was subtle, just the slightest narrowing of his eyes, but Natalie caught it. Recognition. Not friendly recognition. The kind of recognition a person gets when they see something unexpected. Something that doesn't fit the category they've put you in. He stood there for another 3 seconds, then turned and walked away down the corridor without speaking. Natalie continued her rounds. Room for 15 needed fresh gauze packs. Room for 18 was waiting for new 4 bags. She moved through the hospital like she'd been moving through it for 8 months, present but unremarkable, doing her job with absolute competence and absolute invisibility. That evening, a different visitor appeared in the hallway. He was older, maybe 65, with the kind of posture that came from decades of military bearing even though he wore civilian clothes, jeans and a fleece jacket over what looked like an old army PT shirt. He was visiting his grandson in room 407, a 12-year-old recovering from appendicitis. The grandfather had been sitting with the boy for 2 hours when Natalie came in to check the monitors and adjust the 4 fluids. She didn't introduce herself. She never did. She just moved around the room with quiet purpose, checking the 4 sight on the boy's arm, making sure the tape wasn't pulling at the skin, adjusting the flow rate on the pump. That's when the older man spoke. "You did that 3-loop." His voice was quiet. Not accusatory. Just observational. Like he'd noticed something true and was stating a fact. Natalie didn't respond. She completed her check of the monitoring leads, the electrodes on the boy's chest showing a steady, normal sinus rhythm, and stepped back. "Only learned that in the teams," the man continued. "10th Special Forces Group. 23 years. Retired now, but you don't forget how to see it. That technique. That precision." He paused. "You move like someone who's carried a rifle." Natalie looked at him directly for the first time. His eyes were clear and intelligent and they held no judgment. Just recognition. He was looking at her the way soldiers look at other soldiers, not with curiosity about their story, but with the simple knowledge that they'd walked through the same kinds of fire. "Your grandson's doing well," Natalie said. Her voice was quiet, measured. The appendix was non-ruptured. "Standard recovery from here." The man nodded slowly. Then he stood and extended his hand. "Thank you," he said. Natalie shook his hand once, firmly, and then excused herself from the room. She didn't see him again after that, but she felt him watching her work for the rest of the evening, not intrusively, just the kind of watching that another soldier does when they recognize something true in someone else. The kind of watching that says, "I know what you are, and you're not alone." But that recognition came with a problem. Later that night, around 2300 hours, Natalie was processing some missing discharge paperwork in the administrative corridor. It was quiet up there, away from the patient care areas. The fluorescent lights were dim to night shift levels, and most of the offices were dark. Most, but not all. Dr. Sterling's office light was on. She didn't intend to look inside. She was simply walking past, carrying a file folder to the central records room, when she saw him hunched over his computer monitor, the blue light casting his face in shadow. He was typing rapidly, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a kind of urgency that suggested something time-sensitive. His other hand held a printed invoice from a medical supply company, the letterhead visible even from the doorway. He was typing numbers into a billing code field. Natalie's eyes caught the sequence, a legitimate diagnosis code for a patient she recognized, but the associated charge was inflated by 47% above the standard markup. Then he moved to a different patient file. Same procedure. Same inflation. Then a third patient. And that's when Dr. Sterling's head turned. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. The exact amount of time it took for him to understand that Natalie Hayes, the quiet floor nurse he'd noticed had unusual hand precision, had just witnessed him systematically altering billing codes to inflate charges. The exact amount of time for him to calculate whether she understood what she was seeing, and what she might do with that information. Natalie didn't slow her pace. She didn't change her expression. She simply continued walking toward the records room as if she hadn't seen anything, as if his actions were irrelevant to her, as if she was just a nurse doing her job and nothing more. But she heard the sharp sound of him slamming the laptop shut behind her. The noise echoed through the empty corridor like a gunshot. A single moment of panic translated into physics. The sound of someone whose safe world had just developed a crack. Natalie delivered the file to the records room, filed it correctly in the designated spot, and then walked out of the building into the parking lot. The night air was cool and clean, scrubbed of the hospital's antiseptic smell. Rain had passed through Raleigh earlier, and the asphalt was still damp, reflecting the sodium lights from the parking lot in patterns that looked like scattered compass points. She sat in her car for 15 minutes before starting the engine. In that time, she understood several things with absolute clarity. She understood that Dr. Sterling was engaged in insurance fraud. She understood that he'd just realized she'd seen the evidence. And most importantly, she understood that staying invisible was no longer going to be an option. The question wasn't whether he would respond. The question was what he would do. The question was what he would do about her. That answer came the next morning at the nurse's station, where Dr. Sterling held up one of Natalie's charts between two fingers like it was contaminated. The fluorescent lights cast his face in sharp relief, jawline tight, eyes cold as polished steel. He wrinkled his nose theatrically and let his voice carry across the station. "Hayes, even my daughter's middle school handwriting is more legible than this." 3 residents nearby stopped their charting and laughed. The sound was sharp, calculated. Natalie looked up from her medication tray without lifting her head, just her eyes, steady and level. She took one measured breath. "The patient received correct treatment, doctor." Sterling's smirk widened. "That's not the point, sweetheart." The word landed like a blade. Not an insult, worse. A diminishment. A name that erased her from the room and replaced her with a cartoon version of herself, smaller and softer. Around the station, 3 nurses exchanged glances. One looked away. The oldest one, a woman named Cynthia who'd worked Oak Creek for 17 years, set her jaw. Sterling didn't notice or didn't care. He'd already turned to move through the station, the chart still dangling from his fingers like a trophy. By afternoon, he'd moved to what the residents called the corner table in the staff cafeteria, the power position, visible from everywhere, where conversations became announcements. Natalie heard about it from a tech who'd been standing near them. Sterling had spoken loud enough for the entire west section of the cafeteria to hear. $20 as the quiet mouse quits before Friday. She doesn't have the spine for real medicine. 3 residents had grinned and shaken on it, their hands meeting above the table in a gesture that might have looked collegial if you didn't know what it meant. What it cost. 2 nurses at the adjacent table had exchanged uncomfortable glances. One had gathered her things and left early. That evening, Natalie carried her dinner tray through the cafeteria, pasta, a roll, black coffee in a ceramic mug that still held warmth from the dispenser. The food smelled like oregano and institutional butter. She'd eaten standing up for 8 straight shifts, but tonight the cafeteria was quieter than usual. Staff avoided it, sensed something in the air the way animals sense lightning before a storm. Sterling positioned himself directly in her path, a calculated move executed with the precision of someone who'd been planning it. He wore his white coat like armor, pressed and pristine. His watch was the expensive kind, the type that whispered before it spoke. Natalie stopped. The distance between them was exactly 3 feet. He reached out and knocked the tray from her hands. The sound was immediate and terrible. Pasta scattered across tile like shrapnel. The mug shattered against the floor, pieces spinning across the linoleum in a perfect geometric pattern. Coffee pooled dark and spreading. The cafeteria went dead silent. You could hear the ventilation system. You could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen beyond the serving line. Sterling gathered Natalie's patient charts from under his arm. He'd taken them, she realized. He'd taken them specifically for this moment. And he threw them at her feet, papers spreading across the spilled soup, some landing directly in the coffee, ink beginning to bleed. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Natalie stood motionless for 3 seconds. That was the only measure of hesitation she permitted herself. 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, something shifted behind her eyes, like a door closing in a very deep house. A single tear escaped from her left eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Her hand was steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and knowing, with absolute certainty, that this man was not it. "I've carried wounded men twice your weight through enemy fire," she said, her voice dropping 2 registers, becoming something carved from bedrock. "Your disrespect weighs nothing." She knelt, began collecting the papers with hands that had practiced this motion 1,000 times, battlefield efficiency, military corners, no wasted movement. She stacked them, squared them, her movements precise as a surgical procedure. One motion per action. No hesitation. No trembling. The cafeteria remained silent. Someone's badge clinked against a metal railing. A tray slid across a table somewhere far away. Sterling's satisfied smile had faded to something darker, something that looked like calculation. Across the cafeteria, near the beverage station, an older man in civilian clothes watched. He had grey at his temples and a faded army combat medic tattoo on his forearm, crossed caduceus, green ink from maybe 20 years ago. He was visiting a patient in the cardiac ward, had been headed out, but he'd stopped for coffee. Now he couldn't move. The way Natalie squared those papers. Military corners, precise as a rifle bore. The way her hands moved, not nurse hands. Medic hands. Forward surgical team hands. He leaned forward, watching her stand, watching her walk to the trash bin with the destroyed tray, watching her dispose of the food without another word, watching her collect the remaining papers and leave the cafeteria with her head held at exactly the same angle it had been when she arrived. His hands were shaking. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and texted someone he hadn't spoken to in 4 years, "I think I just saw Ghost 6 in Raleigh." Sterling watched her exit, his expression shifting. The public satisfaction gave way to something harder to read, a recalculation. She hadn't broken. She'd barely bent. He'd thrown a punch at a ghost and found something solid on the other end. A winter storm hit Raleigh that night, sweeping down from the north and coating the roads in black ice that reflected streetlights like polished obsidian. By 10:27 p.m., the ER began filling, car accidents mostly, people who'd misjudged curves and friction, who'd learned at 60 miles per hour that ice was not patient. Hypothermia cases. A fall from a ladder. The waiting room filled with the smell of wet clothes and stress sweat and that particular antiseptic and fear mixture that meant trauma. The admitting desk was running 30 minutes behind. The attending physician was a woman named Dr. Reeves, exhausted after a 14-hour shift, and she was making phone calls. At 11:06 p.m., paramedics wheeled in a patient on a stretcher that moved with urgency. Male, mid-40s, vitals dropping. The medic's voice was professional and tight. Severe internal bleeding, cause unknown. Patient's nonverbal. BP 92/58 and falling. No response to verbal stimulus. We've got him on 2 large bore 4s and we're running normal saline wide open but he's still dropping. ETA to OR, now. The patient's medical bracelet identified him as James Kowalski, age 44, and beneath his vitals was a single notation, veteran, non-communicative. Dr. Reeves reviewed the chart, then began paging. First Dr. Sterling, who arrived in 7 minutes, reviewed the case, shook his head. Bed shortage. We don't have capacity. Transfer him to county. Then Dr. Patel, who glanced at the insurance information and said, limited coverage. We don't have the resources tonight. Then Dr. Chen, Dr. Morrison, and Dr. Webb, 5 calls, 5 refusals, all within 18 minutes. Resource allocation. Bed shortages. Transfer protocols. The language of gatekeeping, the medical equivalent of closing the door. Natalie stood at the nurse's station, watching. The mute veteran's eyes tracked every movement in the ER, hyper-alert, scanning, never at rest. That was the look. That was the scan. She recognized it because she'd been that patient once, in a field hospital outside Sanjan Valley, Helmand province, waiting to know if she'd live or die. That battlefield look. That constant threat assessment. She approached Dr. Reeves, who was rubbing her eyes. I'll monitor him overnight. The attending nodded, exhausted beyond argument. Your call, Hayes. He's in Bay 7. Sterling appeared beside her, stepped close, his voice low. Another patient you can't save won't look good on your record. Think about that. Natalie didn't acknowledge him. She was already moving, already wheeling James Kowalski to a corner bay where the monitor lights cast everything in blue and green. She adjusted his fall with that 3-loop technique, fast, precise, the way forward surgical teams taught it. wrap, lock, secure. The kind of efficiency that came from having done it under fire, under pressure, knowing your next move would matter. The older combat medic from the cafeteria appeared in the ER doorway. His patient had been discharged an hour ago. He was heading out, but he'd stopped to check on another case, and he saw Natalie's hands completely for wrap. He stopped cold. 30 seconds. That's all it took for recognition to bloom across his face. Only forward surgical teams taught that method. He watched for another 30 seconds, watching her adjust the line, watching her check the placement with hands that moved like a surgical laser, and then he quietly nodded in recognition and turned back out through the doors. Natalie pulled a chair beside James Kowalski's bed. The clock read 12:14 a.m. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. 2 beats per second, measured and even, the sound of someone still alive. Still fighting. She sat in the darkness of the corner bay while the hospital hummed around her, unaware that one of the most dangerous people in the building had just sat down to spend the night with a patient 5 doctors had abandoned. The question now was what would happen when his body began to fail. The winter storm that rolled into Raleigh at 9 o'clock that night didn't ask permission. It arrived like an unwanted visitor, coating every road in black ice and turning the interstate into a parking lot of twisted metal and shattered windshields. By the time the ER doors swung open for the 10th time that hour, Oak Creek Memorial's trauma bays had transformed into controlled chaos, car accidents bleeding into hypothermia cases, falls on icy driveways, an elderly man who'd slipped off his porch roof. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that surgical white that made blood look darker than it actually was, which meant the bleeding was worse. Much worse. Natalie moved through the controlled panic with the efficiency of someone who'd made these decisions before, though never in scrubs. She'd done this in desert heat, in forward surgical tents lit by chemical lanterns, with sand in her teeth and the percussion of distant mortars keeping time. The ER was cleaner. Colder. The rhythm was the same. The mute veteran came in on a stretcher at 11:43 p.m., his shirt soaked through with blood that had already begun to darken at the edges, old blood, fresh blood, blood from somewhere internal where you couldn't see the damage until the body quit. His name was James Kowalski. His chart said he'd been found collapsed outside a gas station on Fayetteville Street, conscious but unable to speak, and the paramedics had noted something in his medical history that made them mark him as high risk: shrapnel in his abdomen from an IED explosion in Kandahar province, surgically managed but never fully removed. The human body was architecture, and sometimes you had to leave the structural damage in place because removing it would cause more harm. Natalie watched from the nurse's station as the admission team wheeled him past the first bay. She watched as Dr. Sterling emerged from the back offices, looked at the chart, glanced at the mute veteran's face, the kind of face that had seen things, and made a small gesture to Dr. Patel. A shake of the head. Not his patient. Dr. Patel looked at the bleeding, at the internal injuries marked on the paramedic notes, and said exactly 3 words to the resident beside him: resource allocation issue. He didn't even look at James when he said it. He was already turning away. Dr. Chen arrived next, called down from the ICU floor. She spent 90 seconds reviewing the chart, 60 more examining James's abdomen, then stepped back and shook her head. Bed shortages, she said. We don't have capacity for a trauma case this unstable. He needs a level 1 facility. Transferring to Duke. But Duke was 2 hours away on clear roads, and the roads weren't clear. The roads were black ice and accidents and the kind of night where transfer times became death sentences. Dr. Morrison was younger, maybe 6 months out of residency, and he actually looked at James, really looked at him, for about 8 seconds before the weight of whatever he saw made him step back. I can't, he said quietly. I'm still in my first year. This is above my level. It wasn't a lie, exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Dr. Webb was the last one, the attending who should have taken the case by default. He stood in the doorway between 2 crisis bays, covered in someone else's blood from a car accident victim, and he looked at James like a man calculating whether the math of saving this life was worth the paperwork it would generate. His eyes moved to the clock. It was past midnight. The shift was winding down. Not taking any new admits, he said. Critical census. 5 doctors. 5 refusals. Each one a small stone added to the weight. Natalie watched this happen the way a hunter watches prey make a mistake. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury, and luxury was a choice, and she'd stopped making choices based on emotion about 8 years ago. What she felt was recognition. She knew that look in James's eyes because she'd seen it in her own mirror for years, the look of someone whose voice had been stolen, not by muteness but by circumstances that made speaking feel like betrayal. That look meant James had secrets. It meant James had survived things. It meant James understood the particular loneliness of being invisible in a room full of people. Natalie set down her tablet and walked to the admission desk. She didn't request anything. She didn't ask. She simply said, "I'll take him." Overnight monitoring. The resident, a third-year named Martinez who had the good sense to know when luck had just entered the room, looked at her like she'd just volunteered for a firing squad. Hayes, he's actively bleeding from internal injuries. His abdomen's distending. He could go south any minute. Then we'll monitor him, Natalie said. I'll be with him the entire shift. Martinez started to argue, then stopped. He'd worked with Natalie for 8 months. He'd seen her for technique, the way her hands moved like they were reading Braille, the way she could spot a collapsed vein from across the room. He'd never quite figured out why a floor nurse, someone who could have been running departments, teaching, publishing, had chosen to be invisible in the corner of a trauma ER, but he'd learned to trust what he saw. "Okay," he said. "Bay 7. I'll get you set up with a continuous monitor. If his vitals tank, I'll call," Natalie said. She was already moving toward the supply room, pulling 4 lines, setting up a crash cart beside Bay 7, arranging equipment with the kind of methodical precision that only comes from having done it 1,000 times when the alternative to getting it right was people staying dead. The night settled in like a held breath. James was positioned in Bay 7, a corner room with a view of the hallway but enough privacy that the constant churn of the ER felt distant. Natalie started with the basics: continuous cardiac monitoring, blood pressure cuff on his right arm, pulse oximetry on his left index finger. His color was still too pale, the kind of pallor that meant blood volume was heading in the wrong direction. His breathing was labored, the effort of each inhalation creating shadows in the hollows of his neck. She didn't speak to him, he couldn't speak back, and there was a comfort in silence that words would only compromise. Instead, she worked with the efficiency of someone who understood that presence could communicate what language couldn't. His vitals stabilized slightly around 1 in the morning. Oxygen saturation holding at 94%. Heart rate at 118, elevated but manageable. Blood pressure at 88/56, not great but not a free fall. She hung a unit of O negative, then another, watching the color return incrementally to his face, watching his breathing slow just enough to suggest that the crisis, for now, was taking a breath. Natalie sat in the chair beside his bed and didn't sleep. She was trained not to sleep. Sleep was a luxury of people who didn't understand that death worked on a schedule and that schedule rarely included advance notice. At 2:43 a.m., something changed. She felt it before she saw it, the same instinct that had kept her alive in Helmand province, the subtle shift in air pressure that meant the environment had become hostile. James's breathing changed pitch. The rhythm that had been labored but steady became irregular, gasping. His fingers gripped the bed rail like he was holding on to the last connection to something solid. Natalie moved to the monitor. The numbers were screaming. Oxygen saturation dropping, 94 to 89 in 30 seconds, 89 to 83, 83 to 81. His heart rate climbing toward 156. His blood pressure collapsing, 88/56 became 72/40 in less than 90 seconds. She was already moving before her conscious mind caught up, already reading the signs she'd learned to read while watching men die in tents with no walls and no real hope of rescue. His left chest wall wasn't moving right. His breathing was all upper chest, no diaphragm engagement. His neck veins were distended, the kind of distension that meant air was trapped where air had no business being, filling the space between his lungs and his ribs, building pressure, compressing his heart. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis was a whisper in her muscle memory, a voice from training that felt like someone else's expertise that had somehow migrated into her hands. She hit the code button without hesitation but didn't wait for the cavalry. The code team at Oak Creek Memorial was good, but good didn't matter when you had minutes. Her hands moved to her supply cart, muscle memory bridging the gap between who she was pretending to be and who she actually was. The 14-gauge angiocath needle came out of its sterile package like she'd done this 10,000 times. Because she had, just not here. Not in Raleigh. She found the landmarks with the precision of a woman performing surgery in darkness, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the space between his ribs that was now a doorway to death. Her left hand held him steady. Her right hand positioned the needle. One movement. Clean. Certain. The hiss of air escaping. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a lung re-expanding. It was the sound that meant the pressure was bleeding out of the space where it was killing him. James gasped, actually gasped, his whole body convulsing with oxygen-hungry relief as his lungs could suddenly fill again. His lips began to lose their blue tint. His neck veins started to normalize. His oxygen saturation climbed, 81 became 86, 86 became 92, 92 became 96 and holding. The code team arrived 63 seconds later, a senior resident named Dr. Yates at the front, 2 nurses and a respiratory therapist behind him. They stopped. Stared. James was breathing. His color was returning. His monitor showed a sinus rhythm that was elevated but stable. Dr. Yates looked at the catheter between James's ribs, then at Natalie, who was holding pressure over the site with the kind of calm competence that made the moment feel like the most natural thing in the world. "You just performed a needle decompression," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Tension pneumothorax," Natalie said quietly. Pressure pocket was killing him. "Who taught you field decompression?" Dr. Yates was staring at her like she'd suddenly revealed she was fluent in a language nobody knew she spoke. Natalie didn't answer. She simply moved to complete the task, sterile dressing over the catheter, tape to secure it, her hands moving with a 3-loop for technique that made some people in this hospital take a second look at a floor nurse who shouldn't have hands that capable. Dr. Yates understood immediately. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. He'd seen that technique once before, a decade ago, at a military hospital in Germany. He'd asked about it then. Nobody had answers. The code team took over from there, preparing James for transfer to ICU, running a chest X-ray to confirm the pneumothorax had indeed been a pneumothorax and not something else masquerading in the darkness. Everything confirmed. Everything corrected. James would spend the next 72 hours in the ICU, sedated, intubated, healing. He would live. Natalie stepped back from the bay as they wheeled him toward the elevator, her hand dropping to her side, her breathing returning to normal. She had one moment of absolute quiet, the moment between crisis and consequence, the gap in the timeline where nothing else had happened yet but everything was about to. Then her pager buzzed at 3:02 a.m. At the far end of the hallway, Dr. Sterling stood in street clothes, having been called in by the code alert, having watched from a distance as Natalie performed a procedure that shouldn't exist outside military medical protocols. He was standing near the supply room door, his phone to his ear, speaking in a low voice that made it clear he was conducting business that didn't want an audience. "Yes," he was saying. "That's correct. Unauthorized invasive procedure. She's a floor nurse, not qualified. I need an incident report filed immediately." He paused. Listened. His free hand clenched into a fist. "I'm uploading documentation now. And yes, I'll be expecting my favor called in. This is priority." The call ended. He made a second one, still with his back to the hallway. "Nursing director? This is Dr. Sterling. We have a serious compliance issue with Hayes. Floor nurse, performing procedures beyond her scope of practice. I'm documenting an immediate report. Yes, tonight. I expect an investigation to begin first thing in the morning." Another pause. Another phone call, already queued up, already dialed, already in motion. Risk management? Dr. Sterling here. I'm reporting a critical incident. The words kept flowing, each one a stone in a carefully constructed wall, each call a network of favors and obligations being activated. He wasn't angry, anger was imprecise. He was methodical. He was competent. He was a man who had built a career on understanding exactly which levers to pull to make people disappear. By 3:41 a.m., the risk management investigator had been roused from sleep and was on her way to the hospital. By 4:27 a.m., the first documentation had been filed. By dawn, the machinery of institutional consequence would begin to turn, powered by Dr. Sterling's phone calls and favor calling and the particular expertise of a man who had learned that the best way to handle a threat wasn't to confront it directly, it was to activate the system against it. Natalie finished her documentation at 4:15 a.m., unaware that the ground beneath her was already shifting, unaware that saving a life had just set in motion the machinery of her own erasure. The machines kept running. At 4:51 a.m., the night shift documented everything with the precision of people who understood that paper was armor. Natalie finished her notes on James Kowalski's vitals, blood pressure climbing, O2 saturation stable at 94%, catheter site secure, and she knew what she had done. She also knew what it would cost her. Dr. Sterling arrived in the trauma bay at 5:12 a.m. like a man who had just received very specific instructions. His expression wasn't gratitude. It was the flat calculation of someone watching a threat materialize in real time. He stood in the doorway for 9 seconds, Natalie counted, and studied the patient, the decompression catheter, the 4 lines running with fluid and blood products, and the monitor showing the steady rhythm of a man who was going to live because someone had acted when 5 doctors had chosen not to. "You performed an invasive procedure without authorization," Sterling said. His voice was steady as concrete. Natalie didn't turn from the monitor. Tension pneumothorax. 2 minutes from cardiac arrest. That's a physician's call. Not a nurse's. She turned then. Met his eyes. 5 physicians refused him. Sterling's jaw tightened, just barely, but enough. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket at 5:14 a.m. and left the trauma bay, and Natalie heard him in the hallway making the first of several calls. The first was to Marcus Brennan, a board member whose 30-year-old daughter had been admitted to Oak Creek Memorial last year with a ruptured appendix and a complication that required Sterling's intervention. The second was to Patricia Hawthorne, another board member, who owed Sterling something older and more complex, a diagnosis he'd quietly reframed to keep her husband's insurance intact during his embezzlement trial. By 5:43 a.m., Sterling had made his third call to Linda Chen, the nursing director. His words were precise. Measured. Lethal. "We have a compliance issue. Staff member, overnight shift, performed an unauthorized needle decompression on a patient in my ward. No physician present. No standing order. Clear violation of hospital protocol. I need this documented immediately." Natalie heard none of this. She was adjusting James's oxygen flow, monitoring his urine output, watching the color return to his lips. But she felt it. The way the air in the hospital shifted. The way the morning shift began arriving not with the usual tired chatter but with a specific kind of quiet. The way people stopped making eye contact when they passed the trauma bay door. At 6:15 a.m., a man in a dark blazer appeared with Linda Chen. He introduced himself as Richard Patel, risk management investigator. He was thin in the way that suggested he'd spent his entire career removing obstacles without raising his voice. He carried a leather portfolio and a digital recorder. "Ms. Hayes, can you walk me through the procedure you performed between 2:30 and 3:15 a.m.? Natalie explained it. All of it. The clinical findings, the unequal breath sounds, the hypertension, the blue lips, the way oxygen saturation dropped despite supplemental ventilation. The protocol she followed, needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, using a 14-gauge angiocath needle. The immediate response, the hiss of air, the patient's color returning, the O2 sat climbing from 68 to 88 to 94. Were you specifically ordered to perform this procedure? Patel asked. No. Did you attempt to contact a physician first? I called for the code team. No one answered. The patient had minutes. Patel's expression didn't change. Hospital protocol requires a physician's authorization for invasive procedures. Hospital protocol requires patient survival, Natalie said quietly. The statement hung there. Patel made a note. 2 notes. He asked 7 more questions about her training, her certifications, her previous employment history. He asked them in a way that made every answer sound incriminating. By 7:45 a.m., Natalie was sitting in a conference room on the 3rd floor with Linda Chen, Richard Patel, and 2 additional hospital administrators. The fluorescent lights overhead gave everything the color of institutional failure. They had a file in front of them, a file that had apparently grown significantly overnight. Sterling's fabricated complaints. Procedure documentation he had altered. Prior incidents they claimed to have found in her personnel record. Incidents that had never existed. These are serious concerns, Linda Chen said. She wasn't looking at Natalie's face. Unauthorized procedures. Failure to follow chain of command. Documentation inconsistencies. I saved his life, Natalie said. Her voice was level. Clinical. That may be, but the hospital has liability protocols that exist for a reason. We need to protect our staff and our patients. Until a full review is completed, we're going to have to suspend your privileges pending investigation. Natalie nodded. She had known this was coming the moment Dr. Sterling's phone had left his pocket. She had learned years ago that systems protected themselves before they protected anyone else. At 8:32 a.m., her hospital badge was taken. A security officer she'd never seen before walked her from the nurses' station to the main corridor. People averted their eyes. A therapy dog being led somewhere gave her a soft whimper. Animals could smell fear, or maybe something worse, something like resignation. Dr. Sterling stood in his office doorway as they passed. Arms crossed. One small smile. Natalie didn't acknowledge him. She kept walking, past the chapel, past the gift shop, past the double doors that opened onto the parking lot where her car was waiting like a patient who'd been given bad news. The drive home took 17 minutes. She drove at exactly 40 miles per hour, stopped at every red light, maintained the kind of perfect compliance that had gotten her this far. The streets of Raleigh passed in grayscale, brick buildings, bare trees, people moving toward their lives while hers collapsed into stillness. Her apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from a place where nothing good lives anymore. She sat at the kitchen table at 9:15 a.m., still in her scrubs, still smelling like hospital antiseptic and failure. The weight of it was extraordinary. Not the job loss, she had walked away from more than this before. But the pattern. The retreat. The way she had tried to build something small and anonymous and been systematically dismantled anyway. She thought about the 12 years she had spent in Helmand province, the forward surgical teams, the operations that still didn't have official names. She thought about walking away from all of that because the PTSD had made continuity impossible. She thought about telling no one where she was going. Not her family. Not the command structure that had tried to convince her to stay. Not anyone. And still, somehow, she had been found. At 3:15 p.m., her daughter Emma came home from school. She was 16 and had learned long ago not to ask her mother too many questions. But this was different. This was her mother at the kitchen table at 3 in the afternoon, still in work clothes, with a kind of expression that meant something had broken. "Mom, why are you home early?" Natalie couldn't answer. The words were there, suspended, internal, impossible. She had chosen this isolation specifically to protect Emma from the complications of her history. And it had cost her everything anyway. Emma sat beside her, confused and frightened in a way that made Natalie understand what Dr. Sterling had actually accomplished. He hadn't just suspended her from the hospital. He had suspended her from the life she'd been trying to build. He had reached into the fragile architecture of her anonymity and pulled out the foundation. That evening, formal notice arrived. The hospital review board would convene in 4 days. Charges to be presented. Opportunity to respond. She set the letter on the kitchen table beside the faded unit patch she kept in a sealed envelope, the patch from her last deployment, sewn into the lining of an old jacket she couldn't bring herself to throw away. The patch had 47 names embroidered in thread so fine you had to hold it in sunlight to see it. 47 lives. 47 reasons to keep surviving. She looked at Emma, at the table, at the letter that officially erased the last 8 months of her life, and she understood that the real nightmare was just beginning. For days later, the conference room at Oak Creek Memorial felt smaller than it should have been. Natalie sat at one end of a polished mahogany table, facing 6 people in navy blazers and cream-colored folders. The administrator. 2 board members. The nursing director. Risk management. A woman with a recorder taking notes. The rain outside hammered the windows like it had something to prove. The nursing director opened her folder. Your unauthorized procedures. The needle decompression. Hospital policy requires. Policy requires a physician present, the risk management officer finished. You performed an invasive procedure without supervision. Natalie's hands rested flat on the table. She didn't move them. She didn't look away. The rain intensified, drumming a rhythm like distant helicopter rotors. The administrator, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd worn dress whites before this suit, shifted in his chair. His nameplate read Admiral Hayes. No. Not Hayes. Admiral Michaels. Natalie didn't blink at the coincidence. We've reviewed the chart, he said quietly. Mr. Kowalski would have died without that intervention. The medical staff understands that. But the board needs to address the procedural violation. The door to the conference room opened. A wheelchair was being pushed past the window. A man in his 50s, his left side of his face scarred tissue and reconstructed skin, was being moved down the hallway. His head turned. His eyes locked on Natalie through the glass. He began shouting in Pashto. The sound came muffled but unmistakable, urgent, raw, a voice that had traveled through 2 decades to find her in this room. What is that? The nursing director asked. The man pressed his hand against the window. The shouting continued, more insistent now. A hospital translator appeared beside the wheelchair. Security moved closer, confused. He's asking to speak to the woman in the conference room, the translator said, his voice careful. He says he recognizes her. He's saying it in military Pashto. Regional dialect from Helmand. He's calling her. The translator paused. He's calling her the silent angel. He says she saved his brother's life in 2009. The room went still. The fluorescent lights stopped humming. The rain outside became the only sound. Natalie's daughter Emma, seated in the back corner, her mother had asked her to attend, to have a witness, stood slowly. She was 17, with Natalie's dark hair and her father's determined jaw. She stepped toward the table. My mother is a senior chief petty officer, Emma said. Her voice didn't shake. In the United States Navy Special Forces. She's been hiding that for the last 8 months. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Admiral Michaels stood. He walked to the filing cabinet behind him and entered a combination code. A drawer slid open. He pulled out a manila folder sealed with a red security tape. His hands trembled as he opened it. 3 bronze stars, he read aloud. His voice cracked between each word. He set the citation down. 2 purple hearts. Another pause. His eyes had gone wet. And a Navy Cross. For actions above and beyond the call of duty during classified operations in Helmand Province, 2009 to 2011. The door at the far end of the conference room burst open. A man in his 40s, with the posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime making decisions in 30-second windows, entered. Behind him came two men in dark suits carrying federal credentials. Behind them came a younger man in hospital IT maintenance uniform with Marine Corps tattoos visible on both forearms. "Chief Petty Officer Hayes," the man in front said. His voice sounded like a radio that had been underwater for years, ragged, precise, never wasted. "I served with you in Charlie Platoon, 2010. Sanjin Valley. I'm Commander Jason Graves, SEAL Team 3. I'm here because the Department of Defense has a vested interest in your employment status." He turned to the board. This woman executed 17 rescue operations in classified theaters. She field-trained 43 personnel in trauma medicine under fire. She sustained 2 combat wounds and continued operating. She holds a clearance that requires an act of Congress to revoke. He looked directly at the administrator. "And you fired her?" "We suspended her pending," the nursing director began. "You suspended her because a man you trusted was committing insurance fraud," one of the FBI agents interrupted. He opened a tablet. "Dr. Richard Sterling. We've been investigating him for 6 weeks. $200,000 in inflated billing codes. Kickbacks from Meridian Medical Supply. He discovered Chief Hayes witnessed him altering records. So he fabricated complaints to have her removed." The IT specialist stepped forward. A small nameplate on his uniform read Corporal Daniel Price. His voice carried the clipped precision of someone trained to deliver intelligence in hostile environments. "Dr. Sterling accessed the security server 4 nights ago. He attempted to delete footage of him manipulating billing codes in the supply pharmacy. I recovered every frame and reported it to federal authorities." He looked at Natalie. "I knew something was wrong when he started fabricating those complaints right after you witnessed him at his computer. I recognized the pattern. I served with his kind in Kandahar." The room's air pressure changed. The board members were no longer sitting. They were standing now, separating from Sterling's empty chair like water pushing away from an object. One of the men who'd been sitting 3 chairs down from Natalie, the one who'd been avoiding her eyes all morning, stood and walked to the far side of the room. "I want it on record that I was unaware of any fraudulent activity. I move to immediately dismiss all charges against Chief Petty Officer Hayes." The FBI agent nodded to his partner. They both turned toward the door. 20 seconds later, Dr. Richard Sterling was escorted back into the conference room by hospital security. His face had the appearance of someone whose internal organs were shutting down one at a time. The agent read him his rights. Miranda warnings. Words like fraud. Obstruction. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. "This is absurd," Sterling said. His voice had developed a tremor. "You have no evidence. This is a witch hunt. That woman, she's lying. She's making this up too." "We have extensive evidence," the second FBI agent said. He turned the tablet toward Sterling. "Security footage. Timestamps. His hands altering the billing codes. His hands deleting the file. His hands failing." Sterling's face went from red to white to a color that had no name. As the agents placed the handcuffs on him, he twisted toward Natalie. His jaw moved like an animal caught in a trap. "You had no right," he said. "You had no right to." Natalie looked at him with the same measured calm she'd used in the cafeteria when his tray had hit the tile floor. Her hands were folded on the table. Her breathing was steady as a surgical laser. When she spoke, she used 10 words. "Not one more. I had every right. You just didn't see it." The agents led Sterling out. His shoes dragged slightly against the linoleum. The sound continued for 17 seconds after the door closed. Admiral Michaels addressed the room with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Senior Chief Hayes, on behalf of this institution, I apologize. Your suspension is lifted. Your record is expunged. Effective immediately, we'd like to discuss your future as Director of Emergency Medicine." He paused. "If you'll have us." Emma gripped her mother's hand so hard her knuckles went white. Through the conference room window, James Kowalski was being wheeled past again. The mute veteran, the man with the scarred face and the memory that had survived 14 years in a refugee camp, looked directly at Natalie. He placed his right hand over his heart. A salute. Silent. Precise. The kind of gesture that carried more weight than any words could bear. Natalie placed her own hand over her heart and held his gaze for 4 seconds. That was their language. That was how warriors said thank you to warriors. 5 years later, Natalie Hayes stood in an office with her name on the door. Director of Emergency Medicine. Oak Creek Memorial. The walls displayed what had been hidden before, her bronze stars mounted in shadow boxes, her purple hearts in frames, her navy cross beneath a photograph of Helmand province at dawn. The commendations no longer needed to be secrets. Emma entered, now in her 2nd year of pre-med at Duke, carrying coffee and her own secret. She'd been accepted to the Naval Academy and hadn't told her mother yet. "Mom, there's someone here to see you," Emma said. James Kowalski rolled himself through the doorway. He was stronger now, his shoulders broader from the rehabilitation therapy. His hand trembled slightly, nerve damage from the blast that had nearly killed him, but his eyes were clear and present. He carried a frame. Inside the frame, the faded unit patch. Special Forces insignia. Worn at the edges. Stitched with the kind of precision that comes from hands that know how to repair things in the dark. The same patch Natalie had worn sewn inside her jacket lining for 12 years in Helmand province. He signed to Emma, who translated, "I kept this for 14 years. Sewn inside my jacket lining. The night you performed the needle decompression, I recognized it. The technique. The hands. The way you moved like you'd done it 1,000 times in the dark. I knew who you were before anyone else did." Natalie took the frame. Her eyes went wet, not with tears, but with something deeper. With acknowledgement. With being seen. With coming home. Emma squeezed her mother's shoulder. Across town, in the parking lot outside a strip mall on Fayetteville Street, Dr. Richard Sterling sat at a folding table. The table held brochures for supplemental insurance policies. The table was plastic. His chair was plastic. His suit had started to fray at the cuffs. A woman walked past, recognized him from somewhere, shook her head, kept walking. She didn't stop. No one stopped anymore. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Natalie stood in front of a classroom full of nursing students. The morning light came through the windows like it had somewhere important to be. She held a piece of white chalk in her hand and wrote on the board in letters that were neither rushed nor hesitant. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." She turned to face them. The students were leaning forward. One young woman, a first-generation student from rural North Carolina, raised her hand. "What if someone tries to stop you?" she asked. "What if the system pushes back?" Natalie smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that suggests she'd been asked this exact question by the universe, and she'd spent 5 years finding the answer. "Then you take one measured breath," Natalie said. "And you do it anyway." She walked to the window. Below, on the street level, the ER entrance was visible. Staff members were moving through it, nurses, EMTs, residents. They nodded when they saw her. Not with deference. With respect. The kind that comes from knowing what someone has sacrificed. The tremor in her left hand, the one that had started in 2011 from shrapnel embedded in her radial nerve, had finally stopped. The doctor said stress sometimes made phantom pain worse. Natalie knew the truth. The pain had only stopped when she stopped running from who she was. The classroom was waiting for her next word. 16 faces. 16 different reasons to become a nurse. 16 possibilities for invisible warriors. "You're going to witness things," Natalie told them. "People saying you're just a nurse. People saying your hands aren't qualified. People saying your voice doesn't matter. Ignore them. The next time someone needs help and 5 others walk away, that's when you find out who you really are." One student was taking notes. Another was crying quietly. The first-generation girl from rural North Carolina was nodding like she'd already made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Natalie dismissed the class and walked back to her office. On her desk, a stack of transfer requests from nurses at other hospitals who wanted to train under her. In her drawer, commendation letters from every major military installation. On her wall, the photograph of James Kowalski holding the unit patch, his hand over his heart, his eyes meeting hers across a conference room that had witnessed the moment a warrior stopped hiding. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below with your own story. What would you have done in Natalie's position? When the system pushes back, do you push forward? Let's talk about it in the comments. Thank you for watching.